12, I was training for this event. I bought a camera, I filmed the world champion, cut every stride that he took, step by step by step. I used to put it up on my own little screen and watch and wondered where I was losing the time that I needed to gain. And finally I came to a time where the Olympic selection committee selected me to represent the country. He said I was still quite a bit off the world pace. He said, but I went with huge gusto. And I was there ready. I said, I remember that. He said, and all of a sudden I found myself in the finals and was about to pull off the biggest upset in my event. I'd gained nearly 6 or 7 seconds in that event, which was quite remarkable. He said, but you know, Ravi, my heart was breaking because from the time I was 12, my father kept calling me a loser. He said, you're never going to make it. You're never going to make it. He said, and he even refused to come to the Olympics. He said, you wasted all this money, all these years. You're going to come away empty-handed for what? Just to be able to say you've competed in the Olympics? He said, now I was awaiting the gunshot for the final, and I was being tipped to win the gold medal. He said, as I was getting ready, and the gunshot was about to sound, he said, from out of nowhere, the thought I least expected to come into my mind was the thought, is my daddy watching? He said, I lost a stride. But I breasted the tape, and I won a bronze. I said, that's not bad, is it? To be number 3 in the world? He said, no, I really am not talking about that. He said, I'd give up all the medals I've ever won to enjoy the love of my father. I didn't expect a whisper of that thought from a man so solidly built, now in his post-competitive years, wishing he had his dad's arms around him. What language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend? For this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. I don't have time to trace back to the book of Ezekiel, or trace forward, I should say, to the book of Ezekiel and on to Malachi. Because the book of Malachi begins with the verse, I have loved you. And you say, in what way? They didn't even understand what he meant. In Isaiah, he says, what more could I have done for you that I have not already done? Wherefore, when I'm looking for grapes, why are you bringing forth wild grapes? The idea of God's love punctuating through the Old Testament. I read Ezekiel 16 sometime. It's powerful in its analogy. So here it is, God's love, unmerited, grows on relationship, desperately needed. But then God comes up with a complaint. Chapter 6 and verse 4, your goodness like the morning cloud and like the early dew, it goes away. What is he saying? He says, you know what? Just like Gomer, you come back home and apologize to your husband and to your children and say, I won't do it again. But a few days later, you're gone back into your prostitution. Like the dew is here for a moment and is gone. Like the cloud comes and it's gone. Your goodness is like the morning cloud. Like the early dew, it goes away. You know what God's biggest problem is with you and me? A fluctuating will. A fluctuating will. You can come forward, make a commitment, and then a month later you say, I don't feel the same anymore. What happened? See, the will is the greatest gift that God has given to you, but it's also the greatest vulnerability. What was the temptation of the garden? Very simple. Why don't you do this and you will be as God, knowing good and evil? What it really meant was, why don't you do this and you can define good and evil? You become the definer. You make your own absolutes. What greater privilege than that? You don't need God's absolutes. Make your own. And the day you defy this one law, you become the definer of all laws. The will. You know, my older brother in India was, he was a computer systems engineer with IBM when we were living in Toronto, and he asked my father one day to arrange for him to find a bride in India. And I walked into his room, I said, let me get this straight. You're going to ask Dad to go and find a bride for you in India? You're all right? You're okay? Your every thinking is sane here? I said, you're not going to even go and check this out? He said, no, it's okay. It's okay. I said, Ajit, I don't believe this. And so every week we'd get an envelope full of pictures, photographs. Oh, what a lot of fun we had around the dinner table. That's a 7, that's an 8, this is a 6, this is a 5, all of us pitching in, all on the basis of a photograph. That's it. You so much. And one day I sat him down before he was to go. He hadn't seen her. He was going to fly to Bombay, now called Mumbai. Politicians have nothing better to do than to change the names of cities. They flew to Mumbai. And he was going to arrive there on a Wednesday. He was going to be engaged on a Thursday, going to get married on a Saturday, turn around, come back on a Sunday. A 4-day deal. I said, now, what are you going to do when you arrive there and you look at her and say, good grief, what have I done? Or she looks at you and says, I hope it's his brother and not him that I'm looking at right now. What are you going to do? He said, let me tell you something, Rob. Let me tell you something. When you will to love somebody, you can. So, wow. Now, I don't want to take away from everything he said, but a lot of what he said is very true. Without the will, it's a drudgery. Without the emotions, it's a mockery. And you need both. You need that emotional stirring within you, but you need the will to honor and keep that commitment. Let your goodness not be like the morning cloud or like the dew. Next time you feel his presence, make that commitment, but nurture that commitment so his presence will ever be felt with you day after day after day. And that will is surrender. You see, God's love is unmerited. His heartache is our will. His response is, I will be to you as a moth, I will be to you as a lion, I will remove my presence and depart from you. What does a moth do? It weakens. What does a lion do? It tears apart. He said, I'll be to you as a moth, weakening your land. If you don't respond, I'll be to you as a lion, tearing up your nation. If you still don't respond, I will remove my presence and depart from you. May I dare suggest, living where I do in the United States, we are probably in that third stage right now. Ashley and I had a talk about this in Atlanta at one stage when he first came to talk to me about coming here. We lack wisdom. We lack wisdom. Do you know we talk so much about human rights? Ask the person who talks to you about human rights if they know that it also means to give a person the right to be human.
The purpose of RZIM is to engage meaningfully with the questions and heartfelt issues of our culture. We do that in areas of business, academia, politics, the arts, and media. We live in an age of confusion, and people from every continent are beginning to wonder whether there are any answers to life's biggest questions. And this has provided a remarkable opportunity for the gospel of Jesus Christ. RZIM consists of over 50 speakers and adjuncts operating in over 20 countries, working at every level to reach those who shape the culture of a country and its future direction with the gospel. In addition to taking the gospel to various arenas of influence, we are also committed to providing a variety of training events in order to meet people where they are and to answer their questions directly. Whether it's engaging young adults and students through Reboot, Remind, and Big Deal questions, or the training we offer through the OCCA, RZIM Academy, and the New Zacharias Institute, we want to be able to take the questions that often serve as barriers to belief and instead use these as opportunities to share the gospel. By clearing those barriers, we can equip people to then engage with their friends, family, colleagues, and institutions. Our purpose is not only to increase people's knowledge, but to address the obstacles that stop people from seeing the credibility and beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
What does it mean to be human? Talk to an average university student in North America, ask them to define life and purpose, ask them to define meaning, ask them to define absolutes, ask them to define love. All of these terms are with their feet firmly planted in midair. There's no solidity to it anymore. Purely relativistic. I was at UCLA last week, California, liberal campus, and they asked me to speak on tolerance. Do you know how many showed up on that Wednesday night? Nearly 3,000 of them. They had to open up an extra room. Wow. And when we did the same subject at Clemson in the South, 9,000. When John Lennox, Michael Ramsden, two of my colleagues, and I did an open forum on the defense of the Christian faith at the University of Arizona, which is one of the largest universities in the country, a few months before us, Richard Dawkins was there. They drew 3,000. When we did our open forum, they moved us to the basketball arena. Over 9,000 showed up for that. The hunger. They want answers to these questions. I give you this quote and move finally to my last thought. G.K. Chesterton, describing the world to which we were entering, said it in these powerful words. Please turn on the intensity of thinking here, because this is a mouthful of a quote. The new rebel who rebels against everything is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women, then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts, then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. It is Chesterton who went on to say, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a man ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. He may end up believing in anything. Wisdom. You know, our Richard Dawkins was recently interviewed, and he made an astounding comment. He said, just because you're hungry doesn't mean there is such a thing as food. He's countering Lewis's existential argument. But he was on a radio program on the BBC. You may have read it. It was absolutely fascinating. And he said to the former dean of St. Paul's, he looked at him, he himself is a bit of a liberal, but fascinating, he was taking on Dawkins. And he looked at the dean and he said to him, you know what, most Christians can't really name the four Gospels or even one Gospel. And the dean looked at him and he said, Richard, your favorite book is The Origin of Species? Yeah. Could you name the whole title? He said, yeah, I know the title. He said, go ahead. And I'm quoting you now, forgive me. He's on the air. He says, yeah, the title goes, The Origin of Species. Oh my God. Even an atheist had to call upon God to remind him of the book from which he stopped believing in him. By means of natural selection. He couldn't get those words out of his mouth. One president in Africa, after I finished speaking to the African presidents, took me by the arm. We were walking away, and he put his arm in mine, and he said, Mrs. Zacharias, our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. Where do you go for wisdom? Where do you go to face the tough questions of life? Corruption is here. It's inside. We really think in America we've got somebody who's going to solve all of our problems, materially, emotionally, this and that, and just by the stroke of a pen we're going to solve it. The country has never been more divided. The country has never been more of a monetary and fiscal mess than it is right now in its entire history. What's the biggest problem in India, the world's largest democracy? Corruption is systemic and endemic. Yeah. And then we think we're going to solve it. No. God's response is pretty tough. And finally he says, you know what? If you'll turn to me, I'll heal your backsliding. I'll love you freely. Mine anger is turned away from you. The only recourse is to take that U-turn and come back to him. That's right. I don't know how far away from him you are today. Good. I really don't know. But take that U-turn. He's waiting for you. The great Canadian evangelist by the name of Chuck Templeton, who was a great preacher. I saw Billy Graham say to him, you'd have been the evangelist of the world, Chuck, if you'd stayed on path. But he walked away, took his postgraduate studies, lost his belief in God, and so on. Lee Strobel, who went to interview him afterwards, before he died. And a lot happened between that time too, and when he did die, by the way, in a conversation with Dr. Graham. But Lee looked at him and he said, Chuck, where's Jesus now in your life? He said, I want to say to you, I really miss him. I really miss him. You see, he puts life together for you. He's the skin that holds together the necessary components that you cannot keep together unless God puts it together for you. I'll close with this illustration, and they gave me plenty of time. It's just that I'm so disorganized, run out of it. So let me hurriedly give this to you. In the year 1971, when I was in my 20s, I was in Vietnam, preaching the length and breadth of the country, changed my whole life, brought revival in Vietnam. My interpreter, I've told the story in my book, I think, Walking from East to West. My interpreter was a 17-year-old guy by the name of Hien Pham. 17 years old. I was 25, 17. Cumulative years, 42. And we're traveling around the country by motorbike and U.S. military choppers and C-130s, all this stuff. We were young. And when I bid him goodbye, I said, Hien, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. Thousands came to know Christ. I had my one sermon book, used to put it in my jacket pocket, preach from that the length of the country. I was still an undergrad student in theology. 17 years went by. 1988, I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, speaking. 11 o'clock at night, my phone rings. Brother Rafi. I said, Hien? He said, how did you know? I said, it's the way you always call me Brother Rafi. Yeah, I said, you had that little musical note to your Brother Rafi. I said, where are you? He said, I'm in California. I said, what on earth are you doing here? He said, have you got some time? I said, yeah, tell me. He said, after Vietnam fell, the Viet Cong arrested me, put me in prison because they said I was with the CIA. I said, I'm not with the CIA. I'm a teenager. They said, you interpreted. See, I interpreted for them. I was a translator. Had nothing to do with the American troops or anything other than being a translator in their commissaries and all this. They said, no, we're imprisoning you. And when they imprisoned him, they took away from him any English language books. They only gave him Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels, and Vietnamese and French. They tried to knock God out of me, he said. Finally, one day he said, I got so tired. I said, maybe God is not there. He said, my brother Rafi, I thought of you and your messages and all that we saw together. I kept thinking of you so much. But I was struggling. They were beating it out of me. And one night I said, tomorrow morning when I wake up, no God, no prayer. He said, in the morning they assigned me to clean the latrines. And when I walked into the latrine, I looked at the tin pot in there with all used toilet paper and human excrement. I had a mask over my head. He said, but I thought I saw something in English. I turned around, washed it, put it into my hip pocket. That night, late at night in bed, while everybody was asleep under my mosquito net in this room, I pulled out the piece of paper on the right-hand corner. It said Romans chapter 8. Started reading it, and all things work together for good. He said, I sobbed under my mosquito net. He said, who shall separate us from the love of God? He said, Jesus, you wouldn't leave me for even one day. He said, long story, I finally was released, and I started to build a boat to escape with 52 others. 4 days before I was to escape, Viet Cong come knocking on my door, armed to the teeth, and say, are you trying to escape? He said, no. He said, are you telling us the truth? He said, yes. After they left, I said, there I go, God, again, trying to do this my way. He said, I prayed a prayer I hoped would never be answered. Lord, if you want me to tell them the truth, let them come back. So the day before I was to leave, they come, grab me by the collar, ram me against a wall. You're trying to escape, aren't you? He said, yes, with 52 others. Are you going to arrest me again? They said, no, we want to go with you. 4 of these guys got onto the boat with them, and he said, we were caught on the high seas and we were going to capsize, but these 4 guys were such good mariners, they got us to safety in Thailand. He said, and then I was given refugee status. I came to the United States. I'm doing my business degree at Berkeley now. And he said, I'm just calling to ask if you'll come and officiate at my wedding. I've met a beautiful young gal, a Vietnamese gal here that I want you to officiate. And this goes on and on. He came to visit me in Atlanta, and he sat down with my kids across the table. And they were so young then. And he said, you know what? You're always tempted to do it your way. He said, don't. Don't. He said, do it his way. He will honor and he will bless you. You know what? I don't know where you're at in your life, but if you're a typical audience, there's some of you tempted to do it your way.
That's right.
God's love, God's heartache, God's response, and God's hope. I will heal your backsliding. I will love you freely, for mine anger is turned away from you. God invites you to come and celebrate that relationship. And I'm going to ask you to pray with me now at this time. Father, we need you. And only you are big enough to be able to heal us. Your love is so supreme and so superb. Our wills are so fragile. And yet as we look back upon life, we see how you're a grand weaver. You weave the design. Help us to do it your way. I pray for this audience. Many today probably in need of you. I'm going to ask you, if God has met you today where you are, in your seat, and you're dealing with him, will you do this right now? Don't look around. If you're saying in your heart, Ravi, please pray for me. I need to get right with him this day. Will you stand where you are? Just stand where you are. I'd like to say a word of prayer for you. Yes, God bless you. Just stand up. Don't wait for others. Do it as God is leading you. Yes, God bless you. Are you standing? I'm going to wait a few moments more. Several of you upstairs. Yes, God bless you out there. Thank you. Father, for these that are on their feet especially, I pray it is an outstretched will that will not go just on feeling, but will go with a commitment to that will and make that life available to you in a fresh way. Pour out your benediction on the remainder of this conference. Make it a beautiful time of healing, restoration. I thank you especially for those who work so hard behind the scenes to make it possible. Bless them. Minister to the ones reaching out this morning. And Father, if there's somebody still struggling, like the hound of heaven, follow them to where they go from here, till they stop in their tracks and turn to you. May your benediction rest upon us. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.